Hello, everyone. Today I will speak about the DEW line, which is the distant early warning line. I'll start off my presentation by doing a little introduction and then speaking about the causes towards the construction of the DEW line. Then I will give you details about the actual construction of the DEW line from a pilot's point of view. And finally, I will end the presentation by explaining the cleanup and what the DEW line is today. So first of all, I'm going to start by speaking about the Cold War. So the Cold War isn't a very traditional war. It's a result of many tensions between the United States and Russia. After the Second World War, the United States and USSR, who had once been allies, now became enemies. The Americans, on their hand, were concerned about Stalin's communist rule, and the Soviets were angry at the Americans for their late arrival in the Second World War, leading to the death of millions of Russians. Both of these countries had very powerful military forces, including nuclear bombs, which we'll speak about later on. So this created mutual distrust. Therefore, the Americans and the Canadians needed to put in place a defense mechanism that would warn them of an attempted attack on Canada or the United States. So after the Second World War, the Americans and the Russians were competing with each other to have the strongest military force, and they were also competing within their political aspects, which is democracy against communism. This led to many confrontations like the Berlin blockade, the downing of an American U-2 spy plane, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And there were also the hot wars that erupted in Korea and Vietnam. Although the Cold War had a very negative impact altogether, it also had a positive impact on aviation. Because of the Cold War, Russia and the United States developed jet engines like never before by creating fighter jets that were faster, like the F-86 and the MiG-15, who were at the time unrivaled. It also caused the development of supersonic travel, localized radars, aircraft carriers, the new aircraft design, stealth, and the importance of cargo aircraft. In 1949, there was the first Soviet nuclear test. This was a big wake-up call for the United States and Canada to create their own defense mechanism against the Soviets. The first line that was put in place was the Pine Tree Line. This line was situated between Vancouver Island and Newfoundland. It was effective, but to a certain extent, because it didn't create enough of an early warning to the military. The second line that was put in place was the Mid-Canada Line. This line was a cheap solution to the problem, but the radars weren't effective enough because they only identified, they identified anything that was within their vicinity. So they could trigger a warning when a flock of birds would pass by. This was called the tripwire system. The last line that was put in place was the DEW line, the distant early warning line. This one was spread across northern Alaska to the Baffin Islands. It was situated in the Arctic because it was easiest for the Russians to come to our continent from the north. So the distant early warning line is a series of radars situated in northern Canada. It is a combination of 63 manned stations between northern Alaska and Baffin Island, like I mentioned earlier. Its main purpose is to identify Soviet bombers and create an early warning to be able to either shoot down missiles or intercept fighter jets. They used a small DHC-2 Beaver planes on skis to be able to scout the right areas to be able to build the DEW line stations. There had to be enough gravel and a good view towards the north for each radar station. Then, once they scouted the right spots, the military got involved. So the C-24 Globemaster hauled the bulkiest and heaviest supplies. They could haul 25 tons in total, and they really marked the aviation history by doing risky landings and very long flights. There was also the Lockheed LC-130 on skis, who landed on an ice runway in the Arctic. And to be able to support those two aircrafts, there was a Fairchild C-119 flying boxcar. The most interesting thing I thought about this subject was that 50 Canadian commercial companies were hired to be able to aid the mission in bringing the supplies. This created a new market for commercial ambush pilots. Like I said earlier, 50 Canadian commercial companies were hired, such as Canadian Airlines, Eastern Provincial, Québécois, Nordair, Mont-Laurier Aviation, etc. Overall, 30,000 tons of supplies were brought to the Arctic. During these times, there were numerous accidents. For example, this pilot was named Ski after his accident where he flew into a big snowbank. He broke his plane in 3 places and they gave him the nickname Ski. The conditions were very harsh with a minus 50 degrees weather. So the airplanes were very prone to accidents because they were landing on icy runways. They were lacking many resources for maintenance, and it was also very hard for them to do maintenance on their airplanes because of the cold weather. These were all pictures of accidents. This was a plane in maintenance. And this was Dorval Air Transport, another of the commercial Canadian commercial companies that was hired. This was another accident where the plane overran the runway at the Dew-Line Site 20.
This was by all odds the greatest commercial airlift in history. Canadian and American commercial aircraft of all types and sizes carried the bulk of the airlift tonnage. They winged out along the aerial lifelines which fanned northward into the Arctic wilderness. In all, aircraft carried 30,000 tons of machinery and supplies to the Dew-Line in the winter and spring of 1955. Nothing stopped the men of the airlift. They had no hangars for making repairs. If they needed a warm shelter for changing an engine, they called on the skills of the Eskimos to build them one. If spring thaws melted the ice strips, they got the stuff in by parachute. If there was open water and the material would float, oil drums for instance, in an emergency they just dropped it. Nothing stopped these airmen. Nothing. Men gave their lives. Planes were lost. The supply of the sites by air went on, interrupted only by the fierce Arctic storms.
So as of today, with the development of satellites, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and submarine-launched cruise missiles, the Dew-Line is unserviceable. In 1958, the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System was put in place, and Dew changed into NWS, the North Warning System. In 1985, some of the Dew-Line stations were upgraded with the GE ANFPS 117 radar system, which was much more effective, and they merged with the North Warning System. With the end of the Cold War, the United States retracted their troops from the Canadian stations, with the exception of Alaska and Greenland. However, some of these stations are still manned or are controlled from far away. When the crews left the Dew-Line sites, they left everything behind. This was very harmful for the environment and the animals. They left metals, oil, and other toxic chemicals to soak up in the soil. As of today, cleanup crews were hired to clean up the Arctic, as you can see on the picture here, and gather up all that was left behind.